We're here at Microsoft Research in Cambridge with Richard Banks, who's a Principal Design Manager here. Richard, it's great to be here this morning.
Good to meet you, Martin.
Thank you, right. So can you tell us what you're working on, please?
Sure. I work in a team in the lab here called Human Experience and Design, which is a multidisciplinary group, right? So we've got basically 3 different kinds of people involved in our group. On the one hand, we've got social scientists. So these are people who have a background in cognitive psychology or sociology. And we have programmers. So these are people who write code. And then we have people like me, designers. And so we work as kind of multidisciplinary teams on lots of different kinds of projects. And what the social scientists do is focus on people. They go out into people's homes, they see what they do every day, they video them in their workplaces and so on. And their goal is to really kind of draw out questions from people about how they live their everyday lives. And the purpose of a designer is basically to take a lot of that insight about people's lives and start to think about the things you might create to fix problems in people's lives, to offer new kind of opportunities for people's lives through technology and so on. So basically these 3 roles of social science, design and programming then work together to design new and interesting interfaces or products and so on. But particularly at the moment, a lot of our focus in the group is on machine learning. So here's a new space of computer science that's all about programming computers so they can start to make assumptions for themselves. You feed them lots of data, and based on that data, they start to make conclusions on their own about things that are important or things that are less important and so on. And this is a really interesting space for design, because in the past, when you're designing a product or you're designing an interface, all the things that you know are relatively fixed. But now you're dealing with a piece of code where the output of that piece of code is not necessarily predictable anymore. So this is kind of a whole new space for design and social science and programming, where we're starting to design interfaces that are unpredictable. So a lot of our focus at the moment in projects is on machine learning and the applications of machine learning to new domains.
And that must be a challenge in terms of human experience, because we've grown up used to computers behaving in predictable, deterministic ways.
Yes, absolutely. I think it is a whole new domain. I mean, I think it offers a tremendous amount of potential. You know, so one project we've done recently that we've talked about externally is a project called AssessMS. And in that case, it's using machine learning to look at patients who suffer from multiple sclerosis, to look at the way that they move. And they often work with clinicians to do certain kinds of very repetitive actions. To see whether their condition is improving or deteriorating. And in that context, we're using machine learning to start to aid the clinician as a tool for telling them, as they see the same patient over time, whether their circumstances are improving or getting worse. You know, so there are these very kind of these kind of tremendous opportunities of ways of inferring new things about people's lives. And a lot of the issue there for us, actually, you've got this code, you know, in this case, but actually what you're dealing with is a relationship between this person who's suffering from multiple sclerosis and their clinician. So there's a kind of a human relationship there. So a lot of the issue for us from a social science and design perspective is, what does it mean to then stick a piece of technology in the middle of that relationship? You know, are you undermining that relationship somehow? Are you changing the role that the clinician feels they're fulfilling and so on? So it isn't just about designing the thing or the experience, it's also about what it means to kind of change the relationships or change the situation. And the same in the home.
You know, putting things into people's lives.
Exactly. So a lot of our attitude in the human experience and design team is about sort of the messiness of real life. You know, so if you're looking at the home, for example, the home is full of technology, but some technology is very successful and some technology is less successful. So it's not like all of these systems necessarily work perfectly. You know, if you look at the home context, people often are kind of trying different calendar apps or different solutions or different messaging. You know, it's like they come up with these kind of recipes of ways of assembling technology together that sort of work for them, and that's never really a fixed thing.
I suppose one of the areas where it's impacted on people, technology has impacted on people's lives particularly, is around digital photography, or around photography. From having a shoebox and having perhaps the albums where we had a very special photographs, to taking vast numbers of photographs on all sorts of devices.
Yes, absolutely.
How do we go about, how should we best preserve these digital memories?
Well, I mean, this has been a particular area of focus for me for a number of years, and it started originally when my grandfather passed away, and I inherited a suitcase that had these little envelopes in it with his photos in it, that he kind of labelled. And and I think there were probably maybe 200 photos, beautiful kind of black and white photos that he left behind. And this suitcase was going from family member to family member, and everybody was kind of getting a chance to look. And I sat down and did the sums, and based on how many photos I'm taking at the moment, which is somewhere in the region of about 5,000 a year, my daughter would inherit 200,000 digital photos from me, and that's just digital photography.
Yeah.
So this kind of question of how digital photography is changing. It's not just a question of memory, it's also a question of kind of inheritance and kind of continuity.
Because these are things which we want to preserve.
Yes, exactly.
Some of these things.
But clearly my daughter can't sit down and go through all 200,000 digital photos in the same way as I was able to with my grandfather's photos. So I guess one of the ways I think about it is that we're reaching this strange kind of tipping point where in the past, if you had talked to often when people's grandparents pass away, they feel like they've missed an opportunity to sit down with them and have them tell them their story of their lives and get these kind of anecdotes about how they lived. And I feel like we're shifting into a world where actually, if you take digital photography, our Facebook posts, our Twitter feeds, our text messages and so on, actually what we'll deal with when people pass away is too much information about a person's life rather than too little. And so the question then becomes, how do you make sense of it all, basically? How do you get interesting stories out there that are meaningful?
And what solutions have you found? Are there solutions?
I don't know.
It's an interesting problem.
I mean, there are algorithmic approaches to that. A lot of the things going on at the moment are, or code going on at the moment that can tell the difference between photos that are taken indoors and outdoors, as well as use facial recognition to pull out faces that matter, for example, and things like that. To be honest, I don't think there is an easy answer because I'm one of these people who can't bring myself to delete any photos that I take, because I feel like these momentary, even the very blurry ones, because they all act as kind of little triggers from my memory, and they put me in that place. And I think it's one thing to ask a computer to pull out the key attributes of a photo. It's another thing to ask a computer to tell you which one is most personal to you. Because often the most personal one is a fleeting snapshot of somebody going past. I have these great shots of my daughter kind of shooting past, where actually you don't see the front of her face; she's going out of frame, and they're really evocative.
Which an algorithm which says this is a bad photograph, as Boots used to do with the little sticky labels.
Absolutely, yeah.
Isn't going to do it.
See that. So I think serendipity is an interesting property that's underexplored. This idea that actually dropping in and out of all of this content is a compelling experience. So, for example, at home, I have an all-in-one PC in my lounge, and it has all of my digital photos and all of my wife's digital photos on it, and it randomly shows things from the last 15 years since we've been taking shots with digital cameras, and it's very evocative just to kind of spontaneously see these moments from, and some of which are from events that really matter, like our wedding and my daughter's birth and so on.
The things which would have made it into the shoebox.
Exactly, yes. That you might build an album around, but some of them are really fleeting moments of just kind of like a walk we took, or feeding the ducks, or these things, and we found that actually those fleeting moments can be as evocative as the meaningful ones. So that idea that you can build interfaces that are about showing things more randomly, pulling from the bag, maybe occasionally showing threads of narrative, but most of the time just kind of enticing you with randomness. I think that's quite nice.
So there perhaps is a danger then that we remember too much now, that the data is preserved for all time, or potentially for all time. Do you think there ought to be a mechanism to forget things from the digital archive, to let some data fade away?
I think that remembering is different from preserving. I think that in the case of those 200,000 photos, they sit in a folder or a set of folders somewhere, and I don't remember them all until I see them in order to recall them. So it's not like I have this kind of photographic, literal memory of everything that's in that archive. So actually
selectively. Remember the things that
absolutely, yes.
We want to.
As these things, even like smell and hearing things, as these kind of evoke moments. So actually, I think we draw a lot of comparisons with the shoebox, that people used to have full of photos. But there's not a lot of difference between that shoebox full of photos that somebody was going to go through and organise one day and make a nice album out of, and these folders and places that we leave these these photos in, you know. So I don't think necessarily that the fact that we've got all of this stuff means that we remember all of this stuff. I do think, you know, we've done some research looking at people who were recently bereaved, and I think for them, they often feel like technology doesn't have the subtlety of being able to put things away, you know. So as an example, you know, if you've got a woman whose husband has recently died, having all these objects around her still in this house that they share, it's this constant evocation of the past.
Yes.
And sometimes people choose to put things in a box and tuck them away in the loft, you know, so they know they've got these things, but there isn't the pain of
preserve, but not a continual reminder.
Yes, exactly. And I think one thing technology isn't great about is saying there are different kinds of storage. There are some kinds of storage that are kind of short term and I want them at hand, but there are some storage that is really about putting away, you know, and keeping for another day.
Do you think technology changes us?
I don't know. I mean, this is a debate we have a lot in our group, that actually one of the feelings we often get from the work that we do is that technology continues to reinforce the same human values that we've always had, you know. So
Which seems reassuring.
Yes, yeah, I think that is, you know. I feel like, you know, so for example, if you look at Facebook, most of the studies say that for most people, Facebook is about reinforcing existing relationships with other people. They actually discover
for young people as well as
for young people as well, and you know, and I can't decide. You know, we've done studies with different projects that we've worked on where we've got quite young people. You know, there is this sense that kind of there's this these digital generations growing up, and they have quite a different attitude towards technology. And to be honest, I'm not so sure. You know, we've done focus groups. We did focus groups recently talking to different age ranges about AI and machine learning. And you know, some of our groups were kind of 25 to 50-year-olds, and some of our groups were, I think we had a group that was 16 to 20-year-olds, and we had 16-year-olds who were very hesitant about AI and machine learning, certain approaches to AI and machine learning, but they were saying things like, you know, well, I bet if you talk to a 12-year-old or an 11-year-old who's really grown up with technology, you know, I bet they'd have a different attitude. And this is coming from 16-year-olds, you know, so actually,
with my 18-year-old students at Roehampton.
Right, really, yes.
Relatively conservative.
So there's more of that picking up on the conservatism of parents, and you know, then I think we really give value to. That's not to say that they're not fluent in technology in a different way that we are. I'm just not entirely sure that their attitudes to technology are so different generationally. You know.
Do you think that younger generation are more reliant on technology than our generation? Are they too reliant?
I think that, you know, so I've got a 10-year-old daughter,
Okay.
you know, so she's reaching that point where the social interactions with her friends happen through devices as well as socially, you know. So, but I can't decide whether, you know, her coming home from school and immediately wanting to Skype with her friends is that different from 20 years ago, having somebody come home from school and then spending 2 hours on the landline, you know, with those kinds of things. You know? So I think the mediation of those relationships is quite different, and you know, through things like these devices, you know, through messaging as well as through word, you know, through vocalization, if you like. But I think, so I think for my daughter, that digital experience is kind of an imperative way for her to keep these social relationships going that really kind of clearly matter to her.
But that's been something that has mattered to young people for a long time.
Yes.
Now it's just mediated through technology rather than face-to-face.
Now saying that, I personally, I'm the kind of parent who's very careful about screen time versus non-screen time. You know, and kind of and maybe that's because part of what I do is very much with my hands, drawing, and, you know, and kind of sketching as a designer. And so it's important for me that my daughter has things to do that are outside, and you know, and so from that perspective, you could easily argue that yes, I think, you know, the screen is kind of a massive
one element of online safety or responsibility is about the opportunity cost.
Yes, absolutely.
Any time spent in front of a screen is not time spent doing other things.
But I think the tough thing is to tease apart. You know, so I end up in discussions with my wife about what counts as screen time. You know, just texting, you know, just sending a text message to a friend count as screen time, or is that, you know, so that kind of subtlety where you say, well, actually she's socializing. You know, how can you separate out socializing from playing Plants and Zombies or something,
and
or something like
reading an
that?
e-book that different from reading a book.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So we have bought my daughter an e-book, even while my wife and I both read them a lot. But it's kind of this sort of inevitability. But so I feel like it's a lot more subtle than that about, and particularly as social relationships are digital as well. That separating out what is good or bad screen time is a really tough thing.
Really interesting. Thank you. Can I turn to design more broadly now?
Yes.
Are there broad principles which define what good design is?
I think so, although I think it is, like most things, more complicated than that. You know, so I've worked at Microsoft for 20 years, and for 10 years of that I worked in product development over in Seattle. So I worked on the Office suite of products, and I worked on Windows for a while. You know, so and I really got a sense of the distinction between a version 1 product and a version, in the case of Word, I think Word is on version 14 or 15.
Right.
You know, so it's a lot easier. You know, it's a lot easier to design a version 1 product and stick to principles of kind of simplicity and minimalism, as well as kind of a strong emphasis on kind of
simplicity and minimalism. You see this as quite different things?
Yes, I think so. I think that some parts of user experience design or technology design are driven by certain kinds of trends. So it feels like simplicity to me is a bit more of a constant. This idea that you design a product that does as much as it needs to and no more. You know, there's a very strong concept in the startup community of the minimum viable product. You know, so this idea that you try and avoid the temptation. You know, particularly when you get into software design, it's a very malleable thing. You know, so it's way easier than right, exactly, yeah. So it's way easier than hardware to say, oh, it could just do this, it could just do this, and so you
provisional nature.
Right, exactly. So you need to put a fence around what you're doing and say, actually, for the first version of this thing I'm designing, it just needs to do this, and I have to resist the temptation to fall off the cliff and start adding all these other things. And you know, so here we'll always say, oh, we'll save that for version 2, and it's basically shorthand for it doesn't fit in this concept of the minimum viable product. And that minimum viable product is all then about creating an experience that's simple, and that also fits together in a way that allows a person using it to really put together a mental model in their head of the relationships between different functionality. You know, so
this comes back to this idea of the machine. We expect the machines to behave in predictable ways.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
A mental model of what's happening there and what the program will do.
And I think there's a tension there because you know, certainly in my days working on Office and Windows, consistency was a big thing. You know, so if you had a toolbar with buttons, anywhere there was a toolbar should behave the same way, so that people always had kind of the same expectations over it. That is quite constraining, though, when it comes to kind of exploring new experiences and kind of moving in new directions. And it's fine if you make the jump from an Office application to a game to say actually the rules are very different, but that's a bit more of a kind of continuum. You know, I've played with iPhone apps that are task managers that are games. You know, and you earn points for completing tasks, and you have a little character, and you know it's a full, even while it sits in this kind of strange
for school curriculum.
Right, exactly. Yes, I'm sure. So I think so I guess I'm saying for that initial product, that idea of creating that kind of simple experience really matters. Minimalism is a bit more of a fashion thing. You know, certainly within the design profession. You know, in the 60s there was a design school that emerged from Switzerland that was all about kind of the careful use of typography and imagery, very much about kind of showing things in their kind of purest form, if you will. And a lot of what's going on in the user experience design at the moment is about that. It's about saying, actually, we don't need to fake buttons that look like 3D like we used to in the past. We just try and make things as simple as straightforward as possible. to a certain extent, that is an aesthetic choice as well. You know, so while you've got simplicity that might be more about functionality, minimalism is more about avoiding distraction visually. But you may make the choice when you're designing an app that actually you want it to look crazy. You know, that it's, you know,
you can do that.
Yes, you can make that choice if it fits in with what you're trying to achieve with the app. You know, like the task manager with the role, that's more like a role-playing game. You might choose to pull in things from gaming and things. You know, so I guess.
Alongside minimalism, are there other principles which stand the test of time? Things which teachers ought to know about, their pupils ought to know about when designing things using technology?
I don't think so. I mean, I think if you can get that core idea that the initial thing that you design has an internal logic to it, and you know, and it does just what it needs to do. I mean, I tend to think that what matters more for me a little bit is the design process overall.
Right.
You know, the end product that you design can you know, you can deliberately design an experience that's messy or that's complicated. You know, like if you want to use Minecraft, actually the first time you play Minecraft, you really need to watch a YouTube video to understand how to survive the first 10 minutes. You know, so it's fine to design experiences that actually are a little bit inaccessible, a little bit hard to get into, if that's sort of your purpose. You know, and so I think there's a lot of diversity in the kinds of experiences that you can design. So I'm kind of tempted to avoid saying, here are the rules.
Right.
But what matters more to me is kind of the process to some extent, that you know, how that exploration goes on through the design process. And that's really about, at the beginning, having a good grounding in understanding what kind of problem it is that you're trying to solve. You know, so I'm lucky enough to work with amazing social scientists here who go out into the field and visit people in their homes and their workplaces and talk to them about their daily lives and understand things that are problems to them and their attitudes towards technology. And it's incredible. That's an incredible resource to then be able to sit down with a group of people and brainstorm a whole bunch of ideas that might solve some problem for them. So I see the design process as this process that's about starting from a point, you know, so saying, oh, here's a problem I really want to solve. And then you go through an iterative cycle where you basically say, how many ideas can we come up with that might be approaches for this particular issue we're trying to solve? And then you sketch lots of ideas and you narrow down to just a few, and then you build a few prototypes. And it might be that you do that in paper, it might be that you do that we use PowerPoint for prototyping, it might be that you write some code. But again, you keep your options open to more than one. You avoid the temptation to say, this is our solution. You come up with a number of things, and then you put those in front of people, you see what their responses are, you iterate a little, and maybe at that point you say, okay, this is the point, this is the direction that we've settled on, and you start kind of digging into detail. But it's that process of basically saying, how do you start somewhere, and then open up as wide as you can, with the goal of then kind of gradually opening and narrowing down to some particular solution that I think is interesting.
So I guess for teachers this is going to be much more about teaching young people this process than necessarily here are a set of principles which you need to learn.
Yes.
This is something which you learn through working.
Yes, that's right. And I think
I like the multidisciplinary team idea. And okay, we might not be able to do that in a typical secondary classroom.
Well, no.
But we can draw together those elements of the thinking about the people, the sociological side of this, and the design, creative side of
Absolutely.
The most explicitly creative side, and then the actual building things and writing code.
Yes. I don't want to. And there's a couple of comments there. One is that you know, I've worked a lot with students at undergraduate level, design students. You know, and so at the moment I'm doing a project with a bunch of students up at Dundee University. You know, and one of the things we did at the beginning of that project is basically have the design students do a whole bunch of the work that social scientists would do in my context. So in their case, over Christmas we basically said, okay, we want you to spend a day with one of your grandparents and follow them around and ask them questions about their home, and then ask them about their technology use and so on. And then you'll use that when you come back as a starting point for designing some kind of solution for them. So I don't want to make the social science side of things and in accessibility, because often it's as straightforward as saying, oh, I'm going to go and sit down with my sister or my brother or my uncle and my aunt and try and kind of find a starting point for an idea. And that starts through a discussion and through kind of understanding where it is that they spend time, what it is that they do,
So one of the things which we say is that there's much more to the computing curriculum than just the computer science bits, or heaven forbid, just the coding bits of that. Human experience design seems to be something which would be really important to include in students' experience at school of this. What do they learn through this that they won't get through just computer science or coding?
I think that technology is basically touching all kinds of aspects of our lives, and there are lots of applications for code that don't necessarily have a person in the mix. Okay. But the reality is that there are so many things now, if you look at apps and so on, that are really kind of human-facing. And so I think what I'm saying is that there are design skills that pretty much anybody can learn that allow them to go through a process for thinking about the role of the person in the thing that they are designing, and some of that is to do with not rushing to code necessarily, but being careful about understanding what the problem is, using really quick, rapid prototyping, post-it notes and paper and so on to sketch out ideas and start to think about things. And that power of drawing, don't be put off by drawing. When I'm talking about drawing, I'm not talking about Michelangelo. I'm talking about flow charts and boxes and so on. Just boxes on a piece of paper. I think that kind of process of kind of slowing down and being a bit more methodical about thinking about the potentials. What you end up finding is that you end up with much more interesting solutions than just going for the first thing that you had your intuition told you necessarily to go for. I think the other thing is if you start to code too early, you become very invested in the code. And so what you end up doing is wanting to make changes, but you're then wrestling with the code because the way you wrote it originally isn't quite the same as the way you now think of it. Now you're trying it out for yourself, and you can save yourself a tremendous amount of pain and heartache by trying to plan as much as you can up front and draw out as much as you can up front, so you have a strong sense of what somebody will be playing with once you finish the experience at the end. So I think for me, yes, you can become a professional designer and work in a design team with computer scientists and sociologists, and your focus is then on drawing and prototyping and all of those kinds of things. But I think a general understanding of design allows you to have a lot more diverse set of interesting ideas, and then also save yourself a tremendous amount of heartache from jumping into the technology too early.
Richard, can you give us some examples of how human experience design has evolved as interfaces have changed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been working at Microsoft for 20 years, and I think the discipline of interface design has only been around a little bit longer than that. I mean, there's a long history of design for technology, and if you look at the space of kind of human-computer interaction, that probably started in the cockpit, for example, of military jets, where people started to deal with issues of kind of ergonomics and how do pilots reach buttons, how do they sit comfortably for hours, how do they see well, and all of these kinds of things. So those are kind of the early examples of interface design. I think that it's only really in the last, so then obviously we went through the era of kind of the mainframe and then the personal computer, and it's only really with the emergence of the GUI, of the graphical user interface, again about 20 years ago, that interface design became more of a thing, that it became clear that a visual approach.
So back in the days of a command line interface, people didn't worry about this?
I think at that point there were very few designers, certainly in product development teams. And even when I joined Microsoft in '95, design was a relatively new discipline. So that's not to say that I think particularly with kind of computer science. A lot of early computer science started with developers making decisions about what was the right or wrong thing, and as these kinds of teams grew, then new disciplines grew. So, for example, within Microsoft, we have a discipline called program management, which is basically sort of a project management role that actually grew out of development. At some point, a development group said, it would be really useful to have somebody who was thinking a bit more about the bigger picture and the schedule and all of this kind of stuff. And I think the design discipline kind of became part of that as well. And the social science discipline, we need people who have explicit expertise in both understanding people and the rationale and the issues that people have, and then visually providing solutions for them to use technology in a diverse set of ways. And I think it's only really with the emergence of the mobile phone in the last kind of 10 years there's been this sudden massive growth in different kinds of interfaces.
The touchscreen really does change.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And
it seems a much more intuitive way.
Yes.
It only seems like that. I remember back in 2000, children in reception class stroking the screen on their computer because that's how they expected.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and I see that with my daughter as well. You go up to every screen and you bash it with your finger and expect it. And I think different, for us here, different kinds of interfaces have pros and cons. And a lot of the issue then is then saying, what is this particular kind of interface good for? So the touch screen is great for this kind of direct interaction, but at the same time, the finger is a relatively blunt instrument. You can get tremendous subtlety out of fingers that you can't get out of a mouse. But in terms of hitting a pixel or a really tight point on a screen, it's a little bit.
Yes, there's a reason why artists move to pencils and paintbrushes rather than doing finger painting.
Yeah. Well, similarly, I think a lot of artists deliberately use big brushes in order to get a different kind of expression. And if you want real accuracy, you go for a pencil or a pen with a .2 nib or something. But if you want to get yourself fluid, if you like, or kind of out of the rut, then you might use something that's a little bit more blunt. So actually, I quite like that on my Surface device, I can both draw with a pen. But if I want to, I can then just draw with my fingers and get a different kind of expression. So I think it's only in the last 10 years that you've got kind of gestural interfaces, that you've got touch interfaces, that you've got the mobile device, the constraint, but also the value of having this small thing that sits in your pocket and carry around.
Things like Kinect and cameras and voice recognition changes things again.
Yes, absolutely. And again, in the same way as these transitions in technology, they nearly always have a backward view. And it's only once you can shake that off that it becomes a new thing. In the same way that the very early cars all looked like, carts from horses and carts. And it was only after a while that the car took on a life of its own and became its own thing. I think that's true of interfaces as well. That there can be a temptation. You move into touch, but the experience needs to be as much like the mouse-like experience as possible. And actually, you only really start to understand touch properly when you start to kind of shake it off and say this is quite a different thing. And it's not that everything is possible through touch, in the same way that not everything will be possible through voice. That there are certain things are appropriate for certain situations and not inappropriate for other ones.
What's coming next? What comes after voice?
I think the biggest area for us is probably machine learning. It's probably understanding the impact of having digital systems that are starting to make inferences for us. And
so
I think
that's interfacing less with the computer. The computer does much more itself.
I think the way we see it here is more that the computer becomes a different kind of a tool. So in the case of doing design, it might be that I have some kind of digital assistant that is feeding me things that are inspiration. Right? So imagine a digital assistant that as I'm drawing is going off to Pinterest and saying, here are some pictures that we think are really cool and related to what you're doing. And it learns how I'm drawing or whatever, and then it provides inspiration for me. Is this idea of having kind of this other entity that is able to feed stuff to me that makes me more creative as a human. It's not like I'm passing my creativity to another entity. It's that we work in partnership to make the work better.
It's a really nice idea. I like that very much. Do you have suggestions for how teachers can best cover these ideas with their pupils? What sort of things should they set as projects or problems?
I think that for me, I'd love for students to understand the design process as a whole. So I think for a lot of students, an area like machine learning is really tough. The project I'm doing with students at Dundee University at the moment is all about machine learning, and clearly they don't have the skills they have to imagine what machine learning is like. It's not yet accessible in a way that is really malleable. So I'm interested in setting students smaller projects, but allow them to have this full experience of saying, okay, go and interview some people, go and talk to real people and understand what their problems are. Then on paper, sketch a whole bunch of ideas. Now, and that idea of kind of resisting coding until you know what it is that you want to do. And to me, a lot of the role of design basically is saving us, is keeping things lightweight enough that we don't become too invested in our code too early on. So I'd love to see teachers think about that process. Yes. And we do, sometimes we do sprints where we compress that process into a day. We basically say, you've got 2 hours to go out in the building somewhere and interview somebody and talk to them about this thing. And then you've got 2 hours to sketch a bunch of stuff. And then you've got 2 hours to build some simple prototypes using paper or maybe PowerPoint if you want to go a bit more digital, or Photoshop, or these kinds of tools. And then maybe at the end you've got 2 hours to do some JavaScript or just do some kind of simple prototyping and get things in motion a little bit. So it's possible to kind of compress that process together, but getting a sense of that iteration I think really matters. And ideally, if at that end of that process they've got somebody they can take back to the person they interviewed at the beginning and say, well, what do you think of this? And basically user test their idea. And I think that kind of also provides a little bit of this.
And there's lots of cross-curricular linkages for this.
Yes, absolutely.
Well.
Yes, I think so.
Not just a computing or a computer science.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, one thing we think a lot about is tools for education, for example.
Yeah.
So if I'm going out into, if I'm doing some geography project and it means going out into some town or whatever and collecting things, this idea of maybe building tools that are for you as a student, that allow you to get your classwork done better, or allow you to kind of think about your work in a different way. I think that's sort of interesting as well.
That's great.
Great.
Rich, thank you ever so much.
It's a pleasure, Martin. Thanks.